For Ventura County, it's interesting. Some of you already know the data because you've seen it in other presentations. So everything we've shown about the US, about the state of California, very unfortunately, for Ventura, the data is not just worse, it's much worse, right? The decade that preceded the pandemic, right, was a period of dramatic economic contraction for the county. I'll show you. The county economy contracted 15%, $26,000 per worker from 2007 to 2018, right? It's a stunning change of fortune for Ventura County. And so we will talk about that data because unfortunately too, some of the drivers of economic weakness were made even worse by the pandemic. So that's to say that weakness was amplified and we have even more work to do now as a result of the pandemic. But this has been an unbelievable 2 years, and I hope, this is the part where I got emotional last night talking to my advisory board, I hope you see, and I hope you have experienced these last 2 years, the extraordinary character of our community. And so one of the things we do, we're going to talk about some hard data. We also want to feature that although the economic picture was very weak prior to the pandemic, and although we have challenges ahead, right now in this moment, Ventura County is doing everything right. They did so many things well. I hope that you will thank your elected officials and other policymakers who behaved courageously during the pandemic. I have some figures on the impacts to children. This is from a study that was done on early childhood literacy reading skills. In the year 2020-21, there was a 32% decline across the United States in the share of kindergartners who score on track for reading skills. There was a 62% increase in the number of kindergartners deemed far behind in their reading skills. And that's important. Black and Hispanic children, right, fared disproportionately large impacts relative to other groups, right? And the reason we care about this is because kids who don't reach reading proficiency by 3rd grade are 4 times as likely to drop out of high school. This is one of the impacts of the pandemic that we'll be living with as a nation for a generation. But I want to celebrate that right here in Ventura County, we were among the first counties in California to return children to in-person instruction. It's in large part because of a county-wide effort that involved the County Department of Education, Mike Powers' office, County Public Health. They vaccinated every willing member of the education labor force in 3 weeks in California, or in Ventura County. And that effort literally became the model for the state. The governor came here to learn about that so that it could be amplified to others. Businesses in Ventura County opened more rapidly than ones in LA County. If you're a business in Westlake Village, you know this well. On one side of Lakeview Terrace Road, businesses were closed because they were in LA County. On the other side of the street, they were open. And that's to say Ventura County did so many things right. So before we jump into some of the hard data, I just want to share this story with you. This is Cesar Morales.
My Valentina, I mean, she totally prefers in person versus virtual. You know, especially at that age with, you know, child development wise, they learn as much from the interaction and play as they do in the classroom in a formal setting, you know. Like other kids her age, she's a very social being, and she thrives on interacting with people. So when schools went to virtual learning and remote, she struggled because she missed out on that interaction with her peers. She had prior to kindergarten, I mean, for her to go through kindergarten in that way was a challenge. One of the things I'm most proud of during the pandemic is, you know, my work with public health and health and human services, and we were at a crisis point and folks wanted schools open, and I met with the leaders there along with touching base with Mike Powers, and I said, well, no one's doing anything. Let's us set the example for the state, and I want all teachers and staff, both certificated and classified, everyone soup to nuts, vaccinated and as fast as possible. For those that were willing, which was over 80%, we vaccinated our school labor force in 3 weeks. And that's what resulted in the governor coming and visiting. And then our model became what was replicated in other counties. And it was as simple as not working in silos and working with the leaders of public health and health and human services on the logistical piece, and we pulled it off. And we pulled it off for our community to have a shot at thriving amidst the pandemic, and that I will forever be proud of. No doubt about it that I think there was a thirst in Ventura County of our school community and our parents to try to work hard to get kids back to school in person. In every conversation I've been since March 13th, it's been, what's the best decision today for our students and our staff? And how can we keep the doors open as safe as possible? Right now is a very politically tense time in America, and also in Ventura County is no different to be subject to that context. But what I think separates us apart is, again, we're still small enough to be able to be all connected by the thread of the family values that are very high in every community. There's this moral fabric that's very rooted in family here. And I think the common thread is we all want to do what's right for our kids. And I think, I'm proud of that here in Ventura County.
So I will show you some other examples of real highlights that the character of this community represents everything that we need to overcome the economic challenges that we're confronted with. All right, so I'm going to go through these really fast because some of you have seen these in other contexts. There was actually a period prior to 2018 when we actually believed the economic history of Ventura County was that we had recovered from the Great Recession, and that in fact the size of the economy had grown by $2 trillion. Revisions to that economic history by the Bureau of Economic Analysis revealed about 15 months ago that in fact the economy, the red line here is the current vintage of data, had peaked in 2007, and that the size of Ventura County's economy had shrunk 15% by this dramatic magnitude that I mentioned earlier. Now, what was interesting at the time, while that adjustment to economic data, that revision, might seem utterly shocking, to us it wasn't entirely surprising because it brought GDP data in line with a number of other economic variables we had been tracking prior to COVID-19, which told a story of weakness. So Ventura County's population had started to decline. It peaked in 2016. And if I recall, today's population in the county is the same as it was in 2012. Right? So there's a loss of about 14,000 residents from the peak. The labor force had declined. It was the earliest sign of weakness, had declined in 7 consecutive years. So when GDP was revised, it brought it in line with population and labor force data. And it also brought it in line with net migration data. There was a net exodus, an accelerating net exodus of people out of Ventura County. More people leaving Ventura County each year for another destination in the United States than coming here. The jobs data prior to the pandemic and even before the revisions to GDP data showed a picture of weakness. Here we break the labor market into different segments. So we have all industries, and you see job growth was positive every single year in the decade prior to the pandemic. But if we look at the highest paying sectors, In particular, those sectors that have average wages sufficient to support homeownership in Ventura County, they saw, in some cases, large and sustained declines. So we were adding jobs in low-paying sectors, and there was a net loss of jobs in high-paying sectors. Again, we believe as a primary driver of that net migration. And this one was a little shocking when we first saw it. The year 2019, the year before the pandemic, this is the Brookings Institution Metro Monitor. It's just one measure, right? So this is certainly not the authoritative measure. But when they look at prosperity, and they use a definition of prosperity as, there may be high incomes, there may be home price appreciation, there may be economic growth, but how broadly shared is prosperity? And prior to the pandemic, Ventura County ranked 96th out of the 100 largest metro areas. And so again, that revision to the GDP history brought GDP in line with other measures of economic activity. Now, then the pandemic hit. So what's the impact of the pandemic? Well, GDP data is the most favorable of all the economic variables. Now, first of all, we believe that because Ventura County was in a position of economic weakness, we would expect a weak economy to have trouble absorbing an unexpected shock like a pandemic more than a stronger economy. The San Fernando Valley, for example, on the other side of the county line, was experiencing unprecedented economic strength prior to the pandemic. They were actually growing more rapidly than any comparable geography. And you see here, so in magnitude, the drop of economic activity as a result of the pandemic was actually smaller in Ventura County than in neighboring geographies like the San Fernando Valley. But you also see, more importantly, that the recovery has been much slower. So 3.4% growth from the bottom, whereas they saw 9% growth last year in the San Fernando Valley, just on the other side of the county line, the nearest geography. You see in terms of jobs data, there was a dramatic contraction in job markets. You see here between the peak in February 2020 and April 2020, that is 2 months. It's amazing. 3 months. You see this dramatic decline with retail, leisure, and hospitality losing a third of all jobs in Ventura County. There has been recovery, but you see that every single sector except for trade, transportation, and warehousing, which is actually the strongest segment in many regional economies, is the only one that's back above the pre-recession level. Right, so we still see losses. There has certainly been a tale of two pandemics and recoveries, right? If we break the labor market into high-paying and low-paying sectors, high-paying being things like finance, non-durable manufacturing, enterprise management, you see much smaller decline, and they have actually returned very close to the pre-recession level. Whereas in lower-paying sectors like education and healthcare, leisure, and hospitality, there was a much steeper decline, and they are still about 7% below pre-recession levels, right? And so again, that's to say, many of the dynamics and the economic weakness that existed here before were unfortunately magnified by the pandemic. Labor force decline accelerated. This one's even more alarming. There was essentially no bounce back. When you see a giant decline, an economy is like, it's often been likened to a guitar string. The harder you pull the string, the more rapidly it bounces back. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that yet. Although it's just the first year, we hope to see a recovery next year. Net domestic migration accelerated as a result of the pandemic. Population decline accelerated. And so many of those dynamics were magnified. Now, this one was amazing. The most unexpected development, and we say this as a forecasting house that's won accuracy awards for real estate. We could not quite, we were off the tail of the distribution. We were forecasting home price appreciation much more rapid than competing forecasting houses, and yet we could not have imagined the dramatic increase from the start of the pandemic. And what we see when we actually look at hard numbers is that from the April 20, that says April 21, it's April 2020 bottom 28.1% increase in home values, average across existing single-family homes. So dramatic appreciation. Now, interestingly, some of this, what we were talking about a year ago in this forecast event, was the role of urban flight. Right? One of the things we weren't sure is, will the net flow be, it will certainly be out of LA County, and in particular denser urban areas, that Ventura County could benefit from that, right? High-income individuals in particular might be looking for an ex-urban environment like Ventura County. We believe that's evident in the data, right? So some of this, there's a net flow out, but this is still an attractive place to live because of the extraordinary environmental amenities, the open space. And so some of this is now demand-driven, right? We believe Ventura County's home price story was purely supply-driven prior to the pandemic. We now have this urban flight demand component that is part of that 28% appreciation. If we look in terms of affordability, one of the important things is to normalize home prices by incomes. Believe it or not, in Silicon Valley, where it's over $2 million for the median home, incomes are correspondingly higher. That, believe it or not, Silicon Valley today is more affordable than Ventura County. And so you see here, 9%, LA County 10.3, United States 5.2, but what's hidden in that is we are all at the very bottom of the affordability scale. So this is a little different. The last one was a median multiple, median home price divided by median income. This is one done by the National Association of Realtors, which looks at what share of the population can afford the median home. And this one's amazing. Because of that 30% appreciation, Ventura County is now the third least affordable metro in all of the United States. 1 and 2 are LA, Orange County, and San Diego. And so that puts Ventura County in rare company. What I was really shocked to see is that San Francisco and New York are the two that are more affordable than Ventura County. All right, and so you might think, goodness gracious, again, there was this weakness. Many of these dynamics have been impacted by the pandemic, and the situation is even more urgent and dire. But this is, again, one of the areas where I believe Ventura County has distinguished itself. And so I want you to watch a presentation by Nick Deitch, architect and designer in the city of Ventura, formerly Main Street Architects. And he tells an incredible story about a change in attitudes about what the built environment looks like, how we engage with it. And I think there's real promise here for addressing Ventura County's housing shortage.
My premise is that we clearly need housing, and we need different types of housing. The phrase I used in that last talk was that we needed everything from tiny houses to penthouses. And I still really believe that. I believe that very strongly. To me, the key is where do we build this stuff? If we're not going to pave over all of our farmland and we're going to build in ways that are more sustainable, what does that look like? We've been on the path towards some intelligent correction in that regard for a long time, but the pandemic has really been a catalytic shift of views about how we live, what's important, what we need, how many cars do I need to own. What's interesting is that these properties that have always seemed like they were off limits are suddenly becoming within the realm of possibility for change. In the pandemic, one of the phenomenon that's been happening is that the participation in public hearings, I think, has dramatically increased, because we can sit at home in our comfy chair and we can listen in on the council or planning commission and click the little button to say something, to offer up our opinion of it. From the outside, I'm as a previous user of these public hearings, that might have terrified me. But what I've been finding is that as many people are showing up at these hearings in support of the new housing as we're opposed to it, and I would say even the trend is more are showing up in favor, not just of the housing, but of the reimagining of the urban form, of the walkability. You mentioned downtown Ventura. People are loving it. They're getting reminded about what it's like to live in a place where you can just amble along and stop at a cafe and see people and this is happening all over the world, but we haven't really enjoyed a lot of it here. So the pandemic has, the downtown Ventura phenomenon, if I had proposed that a year before the pandemic, I probably would have been run out of town, But it was an adaptation, right? It was a response to, oh no, what do we do? How do we make this work? And it's awesome what we can do when we decide that we want to do that. So again, the other thing that's happening there is that we are building, I don't know, there must be at least 10, maybe more housing projects in the works right now in downtown Ventura. And this is something we envisioned in 1994, and people just really couldn't imagine it at the time. It just was too far out. Now, it's like, how quickly can this happen? When can I move in? We can't solve the housing problem by doing what we've done for the last 60 years. We've got to think in new ways. We've got to create innovative housing solutions, and at the same time, those are going to help us solve the sustainability challenges. And I think that's really exciting. What is it that causes us to shift our perspective? And I think there's a wonderful nexus there between economy and sustainability and equity and social justice. And there isn't a solution for each one. There's a solution, that brings it all together.
So there is hope even in one of the most pressing challenges, housing affordability and housing our workforce in Ventura County. I'm going to skip through some of these because I really want to get to the forecast. And the forecast obviously is for a return to the economic weakness that we saw. We expect a modest bump, a recovery from the pandemic lows, but we see unfortunately a return to near zero growth within the forecast horizon. But this is a forecast. Obviously, this is not inevitable. And again, we really believe, and unfortunately, that growth is slower than almost any comparable geography. That's consistent with the pre-pandemic. That's no different than the pre-pandemic environment. But we still think there's real leading indicators of a different future, right? And so this next one, this is really exciting, right? Kristen Dekas was in the room with us. I hope you've seen this in headlines. This is an example of the leadership and innovation that exists in Ventura County. The Port of Hueneme is partnering with FedEx to operate congestion bypass around the Port of Los Angeles, working with Naval Base Ventura County to bring container ships here to simultaneously make an impact in the global supply chain crisis, but more importantly for our community, to also create new high-paying, family-sustaining jobs. And so this is a proverbial win-win. And so I want Kristen to share a little bit about this incredible story.
As you're probably seeing on the news and maybe on the shelves in stores yourself personally, there is certainly indeed a national crisis when it comes to supply chain. And what's really driving that from just a national lens is that e-commerce in our country is up about 39%. And the San Pedro ports here in our backyard, south of us, about an hour south, handle about 40% of the cargo that comes through Asia. And so you're trying to fit a highway of cargo through a straw. I think that's the best way that I can describe it. So they're looking at niche ports as ways and opportunities to move cargo and get resiliency back into the supply chain to deal with those choke points. So what you're seeing right now is this 39% tick up in e-commerce, and you're seeing about 100 vessels in queue outside the major ports here in the San Pedro Basin. And there's no way that Port of Hueneme can possibly divert all of that cargo through our hub. But what we can do is put a dent in a major crisis that's facing our nation. I think a lot of people might not realize that the Port of Hueneme actually ranks in the top 10% of the nation's seaport. We're the 4th largest port in the state of California, the 6th largest on the West Coast, and now we're the 5th largest auto port in our nation. So we have a lot of built-in capacity to make a difference, doing it in a way that we avoid congestion so we don't have problems for our community. I mean, honestly, in San Pedro, you're finding trucks lined up so they're blocking driveways and people can't get to work. That's the last thing that we want to happen here. In fact, we were ranked the greenest port in the nation in 2017 through the International Environmental Green Shipping Summit, or the International Shipping Summit in Long Beach in 2017. And that's our goal, is to do business and conduct our throughput in a way that we're sensitive to the community and the way that we're sensitive to the environment. When we first did some economic studies back in 2013, we saw that our numbers for jobs were around 8,000. Today, trade-related jobs are closer to 20,000. Economic tax revenues coming from port activity have grown from 117 million to 173 million, and total economic output has grown from 1.7 billion to 2.2 billion. And so we've realized this type of growth outside of what we're seeing happen in the supply chain today and all the cargo that's gotten diversion to the port since this has happened post-COVID-19. We actually now are in the process of updating our strategic plan, and so we have the pillars of economic vitality, environment, infrastructure, innovation, and social equity. And what we find that in our community, about 13% of the people in Oxnard, in the Oxnard Harbor District, are faced with poverty. And what we really want to do through the development of the port is make sure the people in our communities are the benefactor of the job growth that we have here in the county. So we certainly want to work and develop those workforce pipelines so they get those family good paying, sustaining jobs that are occurring throughout the trade-related community in Hueneme.
So I have one last feature that I want to leave you with, and to me this sort of ties the whole story together. Again, the economic story is that there was a decade of economic weakness here in the county, that the pandemic in many ways magnified that weakness and some of the dynamics within it. There is a macroeconomic environment and an environment in the state economy that makes Ventura County's situation even more difficult. But we distinguished ourselves during the pandemic. We have all of the leadership qualities, all of the creative and innovative energy that we need to address that weakness. The challenge is to summon all of the leadership that's on display here to address these lingering economic issues. And so I can't think of any challenge greater than trying to conduct the decennial census amidst the pandemic. As you're going to hear, Ventura County had already been scored by the federal government as among the 2% of the most at-risk counties in the nation for an undercount in the decennial census. All right, so it was already going to be hard here, in particular because of hard-to-reach members of our community. And then you layer a pandemic on top of it, right? So this is a story just like Ventura County's economy, a period of weakness compounded by the pandemic and the way it made things harder in Ventura County. And Vanessa Bechtel is going to tell you an incredible story about how the county responded to that. And I think this tells you everything you need to know about Ventura County's future.
Ventura County has been identified by the federal government as 59th most at risk out of more than 3,000 counties nationwide for an undercount in the 2020 census. And I thought to myself, well, I don't understand why that is. And if you look, our community is really a beautiful place, and it is a really diverse place. There are a lot of different economic strengths in our region, but then there's also a lot of inequality. We have definitely a number of hard-to-reach populations. So when we think about the 2020 census, we don't always think about what is at stake if we don't get it right. Not only does the census, the decennial census, set our congressional representation, which of course is really important, but it also is the catalyst for funding for our social safety system in so many ways. And in fact, a study that they did in Georgetown said that every person not counted is a loss of $2,000 per year for 10 years. We were at risk of losing about $2 billion countywide over a 10-year period. And many people don't know, and I didn't know actually myself at the time when Emmett told me, that the census, you don't get a do-over. It really sets the federal funding for a decade. And so it's critical that we get this right. And, You know, when I think about the biggest strength, when I think of what was created and what we jointly did together, and it was hundreds of organizations, government, nonprofits, faith-based organizations, the Taxpayers Association, business, social service clubs, Girl Scouts. It was such a widespread collective effort. There were over 6 languages at the table. It was a beautiful thing. I think about that as really the epitome of what we can accomplish, because we took this challenge and we all said together, everybody counts, everybody matters. Somos vecinos y todos contamos. We are all neighbors, everybody counts. And we attacked this together, and ultimately going from the bottom 2% to the top 95th percentile in the nation. We were 157th out of 3,215 counties nationwide for an accurate count. So going from the bottom 2% to the top 95th percentile, I just think reflects the strength of our region, because it wasn't money that did that. It was people proactively owning the situation and doing all they could to make a difference, and we did. It was amazing.
So to wrap up, and I want to be respectful of people's time because we've run a few minutes over. First of all, 3 of the people that you saw on the screen are here with us today. So Kristen is with us, Nick is with us, and Vanessa. So make sure you go up and give them a great big hug on behalf of all of the people that they represent and have worked with. The other one I want to encourage you, this is kind of a call to action, right? So the Ventura County's economy had suffered a period of prolonged economic weakness. Many of those challenges have gotten even harder as a result of the pandemic. But as you see represented here today, we have all of the leadership and strength that we need to address these. So let's get busy. And we can't wait 1 year from now to come back and to document the progress that we've already seen in Ventura County's recovery. So thank you very much for being with us today.